Here are 10 life lessons by Naval Ravikant. Number 1. Seeking wealth versus seeking money.
Wealth is the thing that you really want. Wealth is assets that earn while you sleep. Wealth is the factory that with the robots that's cranking out things. Wealth is the computer program that's running at night that's serving other customers. Wealth is even money in the bank that is being reinvested into other assets and into other businesses. Even a house can be a form of wealth because you can rent it out, although that's probably a lower use of productivity in the land than actually doing some commercial enterprise. So my definition of wealth is much more businesses and assets that can earn while you sleep. But really the reason you want wealth is because it buys you freedom. So you don't have to wear a tie like a collar around your neck. So you don't have to wake up at 7 a.m. and rush to work and sit in commute traffic. So you don't have to waste away your entire life grinding all the productive hours into a soulless job that doesn't fulfill you. So the purpose of wealth is freedom. It's nothing more than that. It's not to buy fur coats or drive Ferraris or sail yachts or jet around the world in your Gulfstream. That stuff gets really boring and really stupid really fast. It's really just so that you are your own sovereign individual. You're not going to get that unless you really want it. And the entire world wants it. And the entire world is working hard at it. And to some extent, it is competitive. It's a positive sum game, but there are competitive elements to it because there's a finite amount of resources right now in society. And to get the resources to do what you want, you have to stand out. Money is how we transfer wealth. Money is social credits. It is the ability to have credits and debits on other people's time. If I do my job right, if I create value for society, society says, oh, thank you. We owe you something in the future for the work that you did in the past. Here's a little IOU. Let's call that money. And that money gets debased because people steal the IOUs. The government prints extra IOUs. People renege on their IOUs. But really what money is trying to be is it's trying to be a reliable IOU from society that you are owed something for something you or someone who gave you the money did in the past. And we can transfer these IOUs around. So really money is how we transfer wealth. There are fundamentally two huge games in life that people play. One is the money game, because money is not going to solve all your problems, but it's going to solve all your money problems. So I think that people know that. They realize that, so they want to make money. But at the same time, many of them deep down believe that they can't make it. They don't want any wealth creation to happen. So they sort of virtue signal by attacking the whole enterprise by saying, well, making money is evil and you shouldn't do it, blah, blah, blah. But what they're trying to do is they're actually playing the other game, which is a status game. They're trying to be high status in the eyes of other people watching by saying, well, I don't need money. We don't want money. And then status is just your ranking in the social hierarchy. So wealth is not a zero-sum game. Everybody in the world can have a house. Because you have a house doesn't take away from my ability to have a house. If anything, the more houses that are built, the easier it becomes to build houses, the more we know about building houses, and just the more people that can have houses. So wealth is a very positive sum game. We create things together. We're starting this endeavor to create this, hopefully, piece of art that explains what we're doing. At the end of it, something brand new will be created. It's a positive sum game. Status, on the other hand, is a zero-sum game. It's a very old game. We've been playing it since monkey tribes, and it's hierarchical. Who's number one, who's number two, who's number three. And for number three to move to number two has to move out of that slot. So status is a zero-sum game. Politics is an example of a status game. Even sports is an example of a status game. To be the winner, there must be a loser. I don't fundamentally love status games. They play an important role in our society, so we figure out who's in charge. But fundamentally, you play them because they're a necessary evil. The problem is on an evolutionary basis, like if you go back thousands of years, status is a much better predictor of survival than wealth is. You couldn't have wealth before the farming age, before farmers, because you couldn't store things. Hunter-gatherers carried everything on their backs. So hunter-gatherers lived entirely in status-based societies. Farmers started going to wealth-based societies, and the modern industrial economies are much more heavily wealth-based societies. But there's always a subtle competition going on between status and wealth. For example, when journalists attack rich people or attack the technology industry, they're really bidding for status. They're saying, no, the people are more important, and I, the journalist, represents the people, and therefore I am more important. The problem is that by playing these status games, to win at a status game, you have to put somebody else down. That's why you should avoid status games in your life, because they make you into an angry, combative person. You're always fighting to put other people down, to put yourself and the people that you like up. And they're always going to exist. There's no way around it. But just realize that most of the times when you're trying to create wealth, you're actually getting attacked by someone else. and they're trying to look like a goody two shoes, but really what they're doing is they're trying to up their own status at your expense. They're just playing a different game, and it's a worse game. It's a zero-sum game instead of a positive-sum game.
Number two, the power of specific knowledge.
If you want to make money, you have to get paid at scale. And why you? That's accountability. At scale, that's leverage. And just you getting paid as opposed to somebody else getting paid, that's specific knowledge. So specific knowledge is probably the hardest thing to get across in this whole tweet storm. And it's probably the thing that people get the most confused about. The thing is that we have this idea that everything can be taught. Everything can be taught in school. And it's not true that everything can be taught. In fact, the most interesting things cannot be taught, but everything can be learned. And very often that learning either comes from some innate characteristics in your DNA, or it could be through your childhood where you learn soft skills, which are very, very hard to teach later on in life, or it's something that is brand new, so nobody else knows how to do it either, or it's true on-the-job training because you're pattern matching into highly complex environments, basically building judgment in a specific domain. Classic example is investing, but it could be in anything. It could be in judgment in running a fleet of trucks. It could be judgment in weather forecasting. So specific knowledge is the knowledge that you care about, especially if you're later in life. Let's say you're post 20, 21, 22. You almost don't get to choose which specific knowledge you have. Rather, you get to look at what you have already built by that point in time, and then you can build on top of it. The first thing to notice about specific knowledge is that you can't be trained for it. If you can be trained for it, if you can go to a class and learn specific knowledge, then somebody else can be trained for it too. And then we can mass produce and mass train people. Heck, we can even program computers to do it. And eventually we can program robots to walk around doing it. So if that's the case, then you're extremely replaceable. And all we have to pay you is the minimum wage that we have to pay you to get you to do it, when there are lots of other takers who can be trained to do it. So really, your returns just devolve into your cost of training plus the return on investment on that training. So you really want to pick up specific knowledge. You need your schooling, you need your training to be able to capitalize on the best specific knowledge. But the part of it that you're going to get paid for is the specific knowledge. For example, someone who goes and gets a degree in psychology and then becomes a salesperson. Well, if they were already a formidable salesperson and had great salesmanship to begin with, then the psychology degree is leverage. It arms them and they do much better at sales. But if they were always an introvert, never very good at sales, and they're trying to use psychology to learn sales, they're just not going to get that great at it. Specific knowledge is found much more by pursuing your innate talents, your genuine curiosity, and your passion. It's not by going to school for whatever is the hottest job. It's not for going into whatever field investors say is the hottest. Very often, specific knowledge is at the edge of knowledge. It's also stuff that's just being figured out or is really hard to figure out. So if you're not 100% into it, somebody else who is 100% into it will outperform you. And they won't just outperform you by a little bit, they'll outperform you by a lot. Because now we're operating the domain of ideas, compound interest really applies and leverage really applies. So if you're operating with 1,000 times leverage and somebody is right 80% of the time and somebody else is right 90% of the time, the person who's right 90% of the time will literally get paid hundreds of times more by the market because of the leverage and because of the compounding factors and being correct. So you really want to make sure you're good at it. So your genuine curiosity is very important. So very often, it's not something you sit down and you reason about. It's more found by observation. You almost have to look back on your own life and see what you're actually good at. For example, I wanted to be a scientist, and that is where a lot of my moral hierarchy comes from. I view scientists sort of at the top of the production chain for humanity. And the group of scientists who have made real breakthroughs and contributions have probably added more to human society, I think, than any single other class of human beings. Not to take away anything from art or politics or engineering or business. But without the science, we'd still be scrabbling in the dirt, fighting with sticks and trying to start fires. My whole value system was built around scientists, and I wanted to be a great scientist. But when I actually look back at what I was uniquely good at and what I ended up spending my time doing, it was more around making money, tinkering with technology, and selling people on things, explaining things, talking to people. So I have some sales skills, which is a form of specific knowledge that I have. I have some analytical skills around how to make money, and I have this ability to absorb data, obsess about it, and break it down. And that is a specific skill that I have. I also just love tinkering with technology. And all of this stuff feels like play to me, but it looks like work to others. So there are other people to whom these things would be hard. They say like, well, how do I get good at being pithy and selling ideas? Well, if you're not already good at it, or if you're not really into it, maybe it's not your thing. Focus on the thing that you are really into. This is ironic, but the first person to actually point out my real specific knowledge was my mother. And she did it as an aside, talking from the kitchen. And she said it when I was like 15 or 16 years old. I was telling a friend of mine that I wanted to be an astrophysicist. And she said, no, you're going to go into business. And I was like, what? My mom's telling me I'm going to be in business. I'm going to be an astrophysicist. Mom doesn't know what she's talking about. But mom knew exactly what she was talking about. She had already observed that every time we walked down the street, I would critique the local pizza parlor on why they were selling their slices a certain way with certain toppings and why their process of ordering was this way when it should have been that way. So she knew that I was just had more of a business curious mind. But then my obsession with science combined to create technology, and technology businesses where I found myself. So very often, your specific knowledge is observed, and often observed by other people who know you well, and revealed in situations rather than something that you come up with.
Number 3, personal finance and savings.
Let's talk about different kinds of work. Okay, let's talk about how you make money in different kinds of work. And very few of us are lucky enough to start out with anything other than salaried work. We all start with salaried work. My first job was kind of in an illegal catering company in the back of a van delivering Indian food when I was 15. That was my first organized job. I had many jobs before that. I had paper routes. I washed dishes in the cafeterias. So I've done them all. I've done all those jobs, right? So I've done salaried jobs, and you have to start with shitty salaried jobs. You got to work your way up. What helped me work my way up was I just hated these jobs. So I wanted to do something better. I wanted to do something more intellectual. So I kind of earned my way up into better and better and bigger jobs. But it was only when I got to Silicon Valley that I got educated on the kind of the value of owning a business and getting out of a salaried job, right? And so that is super important. Like everybody should aspire to that. So let me see if I can come up with a good example, right? Like let's talk about the real estate business for a moment. It's like a very real, tangible business, right? So the worst kind of job is, you're someone who's like repairing a house. You're like a construction worker, right? So, maybe you get paid $10, $15, $20 an hour, and you have to go to people's houses, and you have to go there at a specific time. You have to show up at 8 a.m., and your boss demands that you're there, and you kind of just repair little pieces of the house, right? So here you have zero leverage because it's just whatever you're doing with your own hands. You have some accountability, but not really. Your accountability is to your boss. It's not to the ultimate client. It's not to the owner of the house, and you don't have any real specific knowledge. The things that you're doing are bare labor that almost anybody can do. So you're just not going to get paid a lot. You're getting paid minimum wage plus a little bit for your skill and your time, and depending on where you are, and that's kind of it. The next level up might be the contractor, right? The general contractor who's working on the house for the owner. That person may be getting paid, let's call it $50,000 to do the whole thing, and then they're paying the laborer $15 an hour, and they're keeping the difference. Okay, so that's obviously a better place to be, but how do we measure that? How do we know that's better? Well, we know it's better because this person has some accountability, right? They have some accountability because they're responsible for the outcome. So they have to sweat it at night if things aren't working right. And then they also have some leverage, and they have not a great formal leverage, but they have people working for them. That's the labor. And they have a little bit more specific knowledge, and that knowledge is how to organize a team and make people show up on time and how to deal with city regulations and those kinds of things, right? Well, the next level up from that might be a developer, right? Now, a developer is someone who is going to actually go and buy a crappy house, and then they're going to hire a bunch of contractors, and they're going to build that house. And they're probably going to take out a loan to buy the house. They're probably going to have the money themselves. They go to investors, they raise the money, then they buy the shell of a bad house, they tear down that house, they rebuild it, and then they sell it. Now, a good developer could make, instead of $50,000 like the general contractor or $15 an hour like the laborer, the developer might be able to make $1 million or $500,000 in profit when they sell the house for more than they bought it for, including the expenses in the construction. But now notice what's required from the developer. Very high level of accountability, right? But someone just asked me, Naval, where to get taxed? Actually, no. Very simple answer to that is people like me are highly globally mobile. We leave. So what taxing capital does is it causes capital flight. Taxing entrepreneurs reduces entrepreneurs. The United States loss is somebody else's gift. So I'm not worried about me. I'm worried about my kids. I'm worried about the next generation who wants the American dream to stay alive. Anyway, going back to my example, the developer takes on more risk, more accountability, has more leverage, and needs to have more specific knowledge. They need to understand fundraising. They need to understand the ins and outs of city regulations. They need to understand where the real estate market is headed and whether they should take that risk on or not. So, that's a difficult one. And then the next level up from that might be someone who's running a fund on real estate. And that person has an enormous amount of capital leverage, and they're dealing with lots and lots of developers, and maybe they're buying huge amounts of houses and inventory. One level above that might be a company like Open Door that's writing code to buy inventory of and carrying a massive book of houses. So you see at each level how increasing leverage, increasing accountability, increasing specific knowledge, adding in money-based leverage on top of labor-based leverage, adding in code-based leverage on top of money and labor, allows you to actually create something bigger and bigger and get closer and closer to owning all the upside and not just being paid a salary. So generally, when you're working in life, yes, you start as a salaried employee, but you essentially want to work your way up this stack that I just talked about to try and get to higher and higher leverage, accountability, and specific knowledge. And the combination of those over a long enough period of time with the magic of compound interest will make you wealthy. How do you work your way up? I mean, I hate to say it, but you just do really good work for a long time, and it is thankless until people recognize you. It's the nature of these things that nobody recognizes you for a long time, and then everybody recognizes you all at once. Like all the opportunities hit you at once.
Number 4, value creation.
I think there's this notion that making money is evil, right? It's like rooted all the way back down to money is the root of all evil. People think that the bankers steal our money. And, it's somewhat true in that in a lot of the world, there's a lot of theft going on all the time. The history of the world, in some sense, is this predator-prey relationship between makers and takers. There are people who go out and create things and build things and work hard on things. And then there are people who come along and take with a sword or a gun or taxes or crony capitalism or communism or what have you. There's all these different methods to steal. Even in nature, there are more parasites than there are non-parasitical organisms. You have a ton of parasites in you who are living off of you. And the better ones are symbiotic, they're giving something back, but there are a lot that are just taking. That's just the nature of how any complex system is built. But what I am focused on is true wealth creation. It's not about taking money. It's not about taking something from somebody else, but it's from creating abundance. Obviously, there's not a finite number of jobs or a finite amount of wealth. Otherwise, we would still be sitting around in caves, figuring out how to divide up pieces of firewood and, the occasional dead deer. So most of the wealth in civilization, in fact, not most, all of it has been created. And it got created from somewhere. It got created from people. It got created from technology, it got created from productivity, it got created from hard work. So this idea that it's stolen is, I think, this horrible zero-sum game that people who are trying to gain status play. But the reality is everyone can be rich. And we can see that by seeing that in the first world, everyone is richer than almost anyone who was alive 200 years ago. 200 years ago, nobody had antibiotics, nobody had cars, nobody had electricity, nobody had the iPhone. So all of these things are inventions that have made us wealthier as a species. Today, I would rather be a poor person in a first world country than be a rich person in Louis XIV's France. I'd rather be a poor person today than an aristocrat back then. And that's just because of wealth creation. The engine of technology is science that is applied for the purpose of creating abundance. So I think fundamentally everybody can be wealthy. And the thought experiment I want you to think through is imagine if everybody had the knowledge of a good software engineer and a good hardware engineer. If you could go out there and you could build robots and computers and bridges and program them. Let's say every human knew how to do that. What do you think society would look like in 20 years? My guess is what would happen is we would build robots, machines, software, and hardware to do everything, and we would all be living in massive abundance. We would essentially be retired in the sense that none of us would have to work for any of the basics. We'd even have robotic nurses. We'd have like machine-driven hospitals. We'd have self-driving cars. We'd have farms that are 100% automated. We'd have clean energy. So at that point, we could use technology breakthroughs to get everything that we wanted. And if anyone is still working at that point, they're working as a form of expressing their creativity. They're working because it's in them to contribute and to build and design things. So I don't think capitalism is evil. Capitalism is actually good. It's just that it gets hijacked. It gets hijacked by improper pricing of externalities. It gets hijacked by improper deals where like you have corruption or you have monopolies. Overall, capitalism is intrinsic to the human species. Capitalism is not something we invented. Capitalism is not even something we discovered. It is innate to us in every exchange that we have. When you and I exchange information, I want some information back from you. I give you information. You give me information. If we weren't having a good information exchange, you go talk to somebody else. So the notion of exchange and keeping track of credits and debits, this is built into us as flexible social animals.
Number 5, the importance of leverage.
Yeah. So to get rich, you're going to need leverage, and leverage comes in labor, it comes in capital, or it can come through code or media. But most of these, like labor and capital, people have to give to you. For labor, somebody has to follow you. For capital, somebody has to give you money or assets to manage or machines. So to get these things, you have to build up credibility, and you have to do those under your own name as much as possible, which is risky. So accountability is a double-edged thing. It allows you to take credit when things go well and to bear the brunt of the failure when things go badly. So in that sense, people who are stamping their names on things aren't foolish. They're just confident. Maybe it turns out to be foolish in the end, but if you look at a Kanye or an Oprah or a Trump or an Elon or anyone like that, these people can get rich just off their name, because their name is such powerful branding. Regardless of what you think of Trump, you have to realize that the guy was among the best in the world at just branding his name. Why would you go to Trump Casino? It used to be because Trump. Why would you go to Trump Tower? Because of Trump. When it came time to vote, I think there were a lot of voters who just went in and said Trump. They recognized the name. So the name recognition paid off. Same thing with Oprah. She puts her brand on something, her name on something, and it flies off the shelves, and it's like instant validator. But these people also take risks for putting their name out there. Obviously, Trump is now probably hated by half or more than half of the country and by a big chunk of the world because he sticks his name out there. By putting your name out there, you become a celebrity. And fame has many, many downsides. It's better to be anonymous and rich than to be poor and famous. But even famous and rich has a lot of downsides associated with it. You're always in the public eye. So accountability is quite important. When you're working to build a product, or you're working in a team, or you're working in a business, we are constantly drummed into our heads how important it is to be part of a team. And absolutely agree with that. A lot of our training socially is telling us to not stick our necks out of the crowd. There's a saying that I hear from Australian friends that like the tall poppy gets cut, right? Don't stick your neck out. But I would say that actually a really, really well-functioning team is small and has clear accountability for each of the different portions. So you can say, okay, this person is responsible for building the product. This person is responsible for the messaging. This person is responsible for raising money. This person is responsible for the pricing strategy and maybe the online advertising. So if somebody screws up, you know exactly who's responsible, while at the same time something goes really well, you also know exactly who's responsible. So if you have a small team and you have clearly delineated responsibilities, then you can still keep a very high level of accountability. And accountability is really important because when something succeeds or fails, if it fails, everybody points fingers at each other. And if it succeeds, everybody steps forward to take credit. And we've all had that experience when we were in school and we got like a group assignment to do. And there were people in there, there were probably a few people in there who did a lot of the work. And then there were a few people who just did a lot of grandstanding or positioning to do the work. So we're all familiar with this from a childhood sense, but it is uncomfortable to talk about. But clear accountability is important. Without accountability, you don't have incentives. Without accountability, you can't build credibility, but you take risk. So you take risk of failure, you take risk of humiliation, you take risk of failure under your own name, which, luckily in modern society, there's no more debtor's prison and people don't go to jail or get executed for losing other people's money. But we're still socially hardwired to not fail in public under our own names. And the people who have the ability to fail in public under their own names actually gain a lot of power. For example, I'll give a personal anecdote. Up until about 2013, 2014, my public persona was entirely around startups and investing. And only around 2014, 2015 did I start talking about philosophy and psychological things and broader things. And it made me a little nervous because I was doing it under my own name. And there were definitely people in the industry who sent me messages through the back channel like, what are you doing? You're ending your career. This is stupid. And I just went with it. I took a risk. Same with crypto early on. I took a risk. But when you put your name out there, you take a risk with certain things, you also get to reap the rewards, you get the benefits. Accountability is important because that's how you're going to get leverage. That's how you're going to get credibility. It's also how you're going to get equity. You're going to get a piece of the business. When you're negotiating with other people, ultimately, if someone else is making a decision about how to compensate you, that decision will be based on how replaceable you are. And if you have high accountability, that makes you less replaceable. And then they have to give you equity, which is a piece of the upside. But equity itself is a good example because equity is also a risk-based instrument. Equity means you get paid everything after all the people who need guaranteed money are paid back. So if you look at the hierarchy of capital in a company, the employees get paid first. They get to pay the salary first. Like in the legal proceedings, the salaries are sacrosanct. If you are a board member and the company spends too much money and has back salaries to pay, the government will go after you personally to pay back the salaries. So the employees get the most security, but in exchange for that security, they don't have as much upside. Then next in line would be the debt holders, who are maybe the bankers who lent money to the company for operations, and they need to make their fixed coupon every month or every year, but they don't get much more upside beyond that. Now, they might be making 5, 10, 15, 20, 25% a year, but that's where their upside is limited to. And then finally are the equity holders. And these people are actually going to get most of the upside. So once the debt holders are paid off and the salaries are paid off, whatever remains goes to them. But if there isn't enough money to pay off the salaries and the debt holders, or if there's just enough to pay off the salary and the debt holders, which is what happens with most businesses most of the times, the equity holders get nothing. So the equity holders take on greater risk, but then they take on, in exchange, they get nearly unlimited upside. And you can do the same with all of your work. So essentially, taking accountability for your actions is the same as taking an equity position in all of your work. You're essentially taking greater downside risk and greater upside risk. But realize that in modern society, the downside risk is not that large. Even personal bankruptcy can wipe the debts clean. In good ecosystems, I'm most familiar with Silicon Valley, but generally people will forgive failures as long as you were honest and made a high integrity effort. So there's not really that much to fear in terms of failure. And so people should be taking on a lot more accountability than they actually are.
Is accountability actually fragile, or do you really just mean that we're hardwired not to fail in public, so it just feels like it's a fragile thing?
I think it could actually be fragile. Like example of accountability is you're an airplane pilot. As a captain, you're taking on accountability for the entire plane. Let's say that something goes wrong with the aircraft, you can't later blame it on anyone else. You can't blame it on the steward or the stewardess. You can't blame it on the co-pilot. You're the captain. You're responsible for the ship. And if you screw up, you crash the ship and there are immediate consequences. In the old days, the captain was expected to go down with the ship. If the ship was sinking, literally the last person who got to get off was the captain. So yeah, I think accountability does come with real risks, but we're talking about in a business context. So the risk here would be that you would probably be the last one to get your capital back out. You'd be the last one to get paid for your time. So, the time that you put in, the capital that you put into the company, these are what are at risk. Even if a business fails and your name's on it, that's not as bad as if it turns out to be an integrity issue. Like your Bernie Madoff, for example, Madoff Investments. That name is never going to be good again in the investment community. You could be Bernie Madoff's great-great-great-grandson. You are not going to go into the investment business because you ruined the family name. So I think these days, the accountability risk with the name happens more around integrity rather than it does around purely economic failure.
The big takeaway for me on accountability is that you will be rewarded directly in proportion with your accountability. I also think this is why people like Taleb rail against CEOs who get rewards without accountability.
Yeah, Taleb's Skin in the Game is required reading if you want to get anywhere in modern life and understand how modern systems work. Then Skin in the Game would be near top of my list to read. But yes, accountability, skin in the game, these concepts go very closely hand in hand. I think of accountability as reputational skin in the game. It's putting your personal reputation on the line as skin in the game. Accountability is a simple concept. The only part of accountability that may be a little counterintuitive is that we're currently socially brainwashed to not take on accountability, not in a visible way. But I think there are ways to take on accountability where every member of a team can take on accountability for their portion. And that is how you get a well-functioning team while still putting credits and losses in the correct columns.
So why don't we talk a little bit about leverage? The first tweet in the storm was a famous quote from Archimedes, which was, "Give me a lever long enough and a place to stand, and I will move the earth." The next tweet was, "Fortunes require leverage. Business leverage comes from capital, people, and products with no marginal cost of replication."
Leverage is critical. The reason I stuck an Archimedes quote in there is normally I don't like putting other people's quotes in my Twitter. Like that doesn't add any value. You can go look up those people's quotes. But this quote I had to put in there because it's just so fundamental. I read it when I was very, very young, and it had a huge impression on me. And we all know what leverage is when we use a seesaw or a lever. We understand how that works physically. But I think what our brains aren't really well evolved to comprehend is how much leverage is possible in modern society and what the newest forms of leverage are. And so the oldest form of leverage is labor, which is people working for you. So instead of me lifting rocks, I can have 10 people lift rocks. Then just by my guidance on where the rocks should go, a lot more rocks get moved than I could do myself. Everybody understands this because we're evolved to understand the labor form of leverage. And so what happens is society overvalues labor as a form of leverage. This is why your parents are impressed when you get a promotion and you have lots of people working underneath you. This is why when a lot of naive people, when you tell them about your company, they'll say how many people work there. They'll use that as a way to establish credibility. They're trying to measure how much leverage and impact you actually have. Or when someone starts a movement, they'll say how many people they have or how big the army is. We just automatically assume that more people is better. But I would argue that this is the worst form of leverage that you could possibly use. Managing other people is incredibly messy. It requires tremendous leadership skills. You're one short hop from a mutiny or getting eaten or torn apart by the mob. It's incredibly competed over. Entire civilizations have been destroyed over this fight. For example, communism, Marxism is all about the battle between capital and labor, das Kapital and das Labor, right? So it's a trap. So you really want to stay out of labor-based leverage. You want the minimum amount of people working with you that are going to allow you to use the other forms of leverage, which I would argue are much more interesting. The second type of leverage is capital. And this one's a little less hardwired into us because large amounts of money moving around and being saved and being invested in money markets, these are inventions of human beings the last few hundred to few thousand years. They're not evolved with us from hundreds of thousands of years. So we understand them a little bit less well. They probably require more intelligence to use correctly, and the ways in which we use them keep changing. Management skills from 100 years ago might still apply today, but investing in the stock market skills from 100 years ago probably don't apply to the same level today. So capital is a trickier form of leverage to use. It's more modern. It's the one that people have used to get fabulously wealthy in the last century. It's probably been the dominant form of leverage in the last century. And you can see this by who are the richest people. It's bankers, politicians in corrupt countries who print money, essentially people who move large amounts of money around. And if you look at the top of very large companies, outside of technology companies, in many, many large old companies, the CEO job is really a financial job. They're really financial asset managers. Now, sometimes an asset manager can put a pleasant face on it, so you get a Warren Buffett type. But deep down, I think we all dislike capital as a form of leverage because it feels unfair, because it's this invisible thing that can be accumulated and passed across generations and suddenly seems to result in people having gargantuan amounts of money with nobody else kind of around them or necessarily sharing in it. That said, capital is a powerful form of leverage. It can be converted to labor. It can be converted to other things. It's very surgical, very analytical. If you are a brilliant investor and you have $1 billion and you can make a 30% return with it, whereas anybody else can only make a 20% return, you're going to get all the money and you're going to get paid very handsomely for it. It scales very, very well. If you get good at managing capital, you can manage more and more capital much more easily than you can manage more and more people. So it is a good form of leverage, but the hard part with capital is how do you obtain it? And that's why I talked about specific knowledge and accountability first. If you have specific knowledge in a domain, and if you're accountable and you have a good name in that domain, then people are going to give you capital as a form of leverage that you can use to then go get more capital. But capital also is fairly well understood. And I think a lot of the knocks against capitalism come because of the accumulation of capital. The most interesting and the most important form of leverage is this idea of products that have no marginal cost of replication. This is the new form of leverage. This was only invented in the last few hundred years. It got started with the printing press. It accelerated broadcast media, and now it's really blown up with the internet and with code. So now you can multiply your efforts without having to involve other humans and without needing money from other humans. This podcast is a form of leverage. Long ago, I would have had to sit in a lecture hall and lecture each of you personally, and I would have maybe reached a few hundred people, and that would have been that. 30 years ago, I would have to be lucky to get on TV, which is somebody else's leverage. They would have distorted the message. They would have taken the economics out of it or charged me for it. They would have muddled the message, and I would have been lucky to get that form of leverage. But today, thanks to the internet, I can buy a cheap microphone, hook it up to a laptop or an iPad, and there you are, all listening. So this newest form of leverage is where all the new fortunes are made. So all the new billionaires. So the last generation fortunes were made by capital. That was the Warren Buffetts of the world. But the new generation fortunes are all made through code or media. Joe Rogan making 50 to 100 million bucks a year from his podcasts. PewDiePie. I don't know how much money he's rolling in, but he's bigger than the news, right? The Fortnite players. Of course, Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg and Larry Page and Sergey Brin and Bill Gates and Steve Jobs. That is all code-based leverage. Now, the beauty is when you combine all of these three. That's where tech startups really excel, where you take just the minimum but highest output labor that you can get, which are engineers and designers, product developers, and then you add in capital. You use that for marketing, advertising, scaling. And you add in lots of code and media and podcasts and content to get it all out there. That is a magic combination. And that's why you see technology startups explode out of nowhere, use massive leverage, and just make huge outsized returns.
Do you want to talk a little bit about permissioned versus permissionless?
Probably the most interesting thing to keep in mind about the new forms of leverage is they are permissionless. They don't require somebody else's permission for you to use them or succeed. For labor leverage, somebody has to decide to follow you. For capital leverage, somebody has to give you money to invest or to turn into a product. But coding, writing books, recording podcasts, tweeting, YouTubing, these kinds of things, these are permissionless. You don't need anyone's permission to do them. And that's why they're very egalitarian. They're great equalizers of leverage. And as much as people may rail on Facebook and YouTube, they're not going to stop using it because this permissionless leverage where everyone can be a broadcaster is just too good. The same way, you can rail upon Apple for having a slightly closed ecosystem in the iPhone, but everyone's writing apps for it. And so as long as you can write apps for it, you can get rich or reach users doing that, why not? I think of all the forms of leverage, the best one in modern society, and people are going to, this is glib, this is a little overused, and this is why I tell people learn to code, right? It's that we have this idea that in the future, there's going to be these robots and they're going to be doing everything. And that may be true, but I would say the majority of the robot revolution has already happened. The robots are already here. And there are way more robots than there are humans. It's just that we pack them in data centers for heat and efficiency reasons. We put them in servers. They're inside the computers, all the circuits. It's a robot mind inside that's doing all the work. And so every great software developer, for example, now has an army of robots working for him at nighttime while he or she sleeps after they've written the code, and it's just cranking away. So the robots army is already here. The robot revolution has already happened. We're about halfway through it. We're just adding in much more of the hardware component these days. As we get more familiar, we get more comfortable with the idea of autonomous vehicles and autonomous airplanes and autonomous ships and maybe autonomous trucks and, there's delivery bots and Boston Dynamics robots and all that. But robots who are doing web searching for you, for example, are already here. The ones who are like cleaning up your video and audio and transmitting it around the world are already here. The ones who are answering many customer service queries, things that you would have had to call a human for, are already here. So an army of robots is already here. It's very cheaply available. And the bottleneck is just figuring out intelligent and interesting things to do to them. And essentially, you can order this army of robots around. Just the commands have to be issued in a computer language, in the language that they understand. So these robots aren't very smart. They have to be told very precisely what to do and how to do it. So coding is such a great superpower because now you can speak the language of the robot armies and you can tell them what to do.
And I think at this point, actually, people are not only commanding the army of robots within servers through code, they're actually manipulating the movement of trucks, of other people. Just ordering a package on Amazon, you're manipulating the movement of many people and many robots to get a package delivered to you. People are doing the same things to build businesses now. So there's the army of robots within servers, and then there's also an army of actual robots and people that are being manipulated through software.
Labor and capital are much less egalitarian, not just in their inputs, but in their outputs. Let's say that I need something that humans have to provide, like if I want a massage or if I need like someone to cook my food. The more of a human element there is in providing that service, the less egalitarian it is. Jeff Bezos probably has much better vacations than most of us, right? Because he has lots of humans running around doing whatever he needs to do. But if you look at the output of code and media, Jeff Bezos doesn't get to watch better movies and TV than we do. Jeff Bezos doesn't get to even have a better computing experience. Like Google doesn't give him some premium special Google account where his searches are better. It's the nature of code and media output that the same product is accessible to everybody. And it turns into a positive sum game where if Jeff Bezos is consuming the same product as 1,000 other people, that product's to be better than the version that Jeff would consume on his own. Whereas with other products, that's not true. If you look at something like buying a Rolex, which is no longer about telling time, it's a signaling good. It's all about showing off, I have a Rolex. That's a zero-sum game. If everybody in the world is wearing a Rolex, then people don't want to wear Rolexes anymore because they no longer signal. It's canceled out the effect. And so rich people do have an advantage in consuming that product. They'll just price it up till only they can have Rolexes, and then poor people can't have Rolexes, and Rolexes resume their signaling value. But something like watching Netflix or using Google or using Facebook or YouTube, or even, frankly, modern day cars. Like rich people don't have better cars. They just have weirder cars. You can't drive a Lamborghini on the street at any speed that makes sense for a Lamborghini. So it's actually a worse car on the street. It just turned into a signaling good at that point. Your sweet spot where you want to be is somewhere like a Tesla Model 3 or like a Toyota Corolla. It's an amazing car. A new Toyota Corolla is a really nice car. But because it's mainstream, the technology has amortized the cost of production over the largest number of consumers possible. And the best products tend to be at the center, at the sweet spot, the middle class, rather than being targeted at the upper class. So I think one of the things that we don't necessarily appreciate in modern society is as the forms of leverage have gone from being human-based, labor-based, and being capital-based to being more product and code and media-based, that most of the goods and services that we consume are becoming much more egalitarian in their consumption. Even food is becoming that way. Like food is becoming cheap and abundant, at least in the first world, too much so to our detriment. Jeff Bezos isn't necessarily eating better food. He's just eating different food, or he's eating like food that's prepared and served theatrically. So it's almost like more of, again, the human element performance. But the labor element out of food production has gone down massively. The capital element has gone down massively. And so even food production itself has become more technology oriented. And so the gap between the haves and the have-nots is getting smaller. So if you care about ethics in wealth creation, it is better to create your wealth using code and media as leverage, because then those products are equally available to everybody, as opposed to trying to create your wealth through labor or capital, because what I'm referring to here is scale economies. Technology products and media products have such amazing scale economies that you always want to use the product that is used by the most people. The one that's used by the most people ends up having the largest budget. There's no marginal cost of adding another user. And so with the largest budget, you get the highest quality. So the best TV shows are actually not going to be some obscure ones just made for a few rich people. They're going to be the big budget ones like the Game of Thrones or the Breaking Bad or Bird Box, where they have massive, massive budgets. They can just use those budgets to get to a certain quality level. And then the rich people, to be different, they have to fly to Sundance and watch a documentary, because you and I aren't going to fly to Sundance because, that's something that bored rich people do to show off. And we're not going to watch a documentary because most of them just aren't actually even that good, right? Again, if you're wealthy today, for large classes of things, you spend your money on signaling goods to show other people that you're wealthy, and you try and convert them to status, as opposed to actually consuming the goods for their own sake.
Number 6, productivity and time management.
Great goal in life would be to not have to be in a given place at a given time. That is a recent vector that I'm trying to work towards. Obviously, it's not fully realistic. You have meetings and stuff, but at a even more basic level, you have a job. Right? Most of us have jobs. We got to go in a certain time of the day and can't come back at a certain time. And somebody else is telling us what to do all day long. And I think it's really worth whenever you can in life, if you have the choice, optimizing for independence rather than optimizing for pay. Because if you have independence and you're just accountable, let's say, on your output as opposed to your input, that's the dream, being accountable for your output rather than your input. We're used to, humans evolved in societies where there was no leverage. So if I was chopping wood or carrying water for you, you knew that roughly 8 hours put in would be equal to about 8 hours of work that came out. But now we've invented leverage through capital, through co-working, through technology, through productivity, through all these means. So we live in an age of leverage. And as a worker, you want to be as leveraged as possible so that your work has a huge impact and it won't take as much of your time or physical effort. Like you'd rather work with a bulldozer than work with, with your hands, the same way you'd rather work with a computer than you would with a pencil. So those are just forms of leverage. So you want to use as much leverage as possible. And a leverage worker can outproduce a non-leverage worker by a factor of 1,000 or 10,000. And with a leverage worker, the choice of how they make the decision is far more important. Their judgment is far more important than how much time they put in or how hard they work. So, for example, a good software engineer, just by writing the right little piece of code and creating the right little application, can literally create $500 million worth of value for a company. But 10 engineers working 10 times as hard just because they chose the wrong model or the wrong product or wrote it the wrong way or put in the wrong viral loop or what have you, they basically wasted their time. So inputs don't match outputs, especially for leverage workers. And so what you want to do in life is you want to be in control of your own time. So you want to get into a leveraged job, and then you want to get into one where you control your own time and you're tracked on the outputs. That would be the ideal. Because then if you do something incredible to move the needle on the business, they're going to have to pay you. And they're going to have to pay you, and especially if they don't know how you did it, because it's innate to kind of your obsession or your skill or your innate abilities, then they're going to have to keep paying you to do it. This goes back to what I talked about in the first podcast. If you have specific knowledge, you have accountability, and you have leverage, then they have to pay you what you're worth. And if they pay you what you're worth, then you can get your time back. And if you get your time back, then you can be hyper efficient. Then you're not doing meetings for meetings' sake. Then you're not trying to impress other people. You're not building checklists and writing down lots of things just to kind of make it look like you did work. All you care about is the actual work itself. And when you do just the actual work itself, you'll be far more productive, far more efficient. You'll work when you kind of feel like it, when you're high energy, and you won't be trying to struggle through when you're low energy, and you'll regain your time back. So I think choosing what kinds of jobs and careers and fields you get into and what sort of deals you're willing to take from your employer, assuming you have that luxury, will give you much more free time, and then you don't have to worry as much about time management. The image that I like to put in my own head, what I would love to do is I would love to be paid purely for my judgment, not for any work. I want the robots to do the work. Or capital or dollars being deployed somewhere out there to do the work, or computers to do the work. But I want to be paid for my judgment, and I think every human should aspire to that, where we're eventually just becoming knowledgeable, or we are knowledgeable about certain things, and we're being paid for that unique thing, and we have as much leverage as possible in that business, whether it's through robots or computers or what have you. And then we can also be masters of our own time, because we're just being tracked in outputs and not inputs. Yeah, think about CEOs. People always complain about CEO pay. They don't understand how it works. Think about this. If you're running a public $100 billion company, right, like you're CEO of a real company that's worth $100 billion, I'm sure you can find competent people who do that job for $500,000 a year, for $1 million a year, $2 million a year. But imagine someone comes along who demonstrably has slightly better judgment, like 85% instead of 75% of the time they're right. Well, you will pay that person, $50 million, $100 million, $200 million, whatever it takes, because that 10% better judgment is steering a $100 billion ship. So CEOs are highly paid because of their leverage. So small differences in judgment and capability really get amplified. Look at professional sports. Nobody wants to watch, the third place, the bronze medal winner. Everybody wants to watch the gold medal winner. So the gold medal winner will get paid multiples because their leverage, their reach is to millions of individuals, whereas the bronze medal winner has a reach to hundreds or thousands of individuals. So they can just for being a marginally better, like running that quarter mile in a fraction of a second faster, they're going to get paid a lot more, orders of magnitude more. So leverage just has that effect and magnifies things. So being at the extreme in your art is very important in an age of leverage. And you're never going to be the best in the world at anything unless it's something that you just absolutely love to do. No one can compete with you on being you. No one can compete with me on being me. So when I think about what my profession, what my job, what my work is, it's just being me. What am I doing on Periscope right now? Why am I here? I'm just me being me. I don't have any other good explanation for it. But I just know no one's going to beat me at being me. So if I ever need to make money off of it, I can. And I'm going to be darn good at it.
Number 7, long-term thinking.
Pareto optimal is another concept from game theory, along with Pareto superior. Pareto superior means that something is better in some ways while being equal or better in the other ways. So it's not worse off in any way. And this is an important concept when you're negotiating with somebody, because if you can make a solution Pareto superior to where it was before, you will always do that. And Pareto optimal is when the solution is the best that it can possibly be, then you can't change it without making it worse in at least one dimension, that there is a hard trade-off from this point forward. These are just important concepts to understand when you're involved in a big negotiation. In negotiation, though, I would generally say that, this is a tweet that I have, negotiations are won by whoever cares less. Negotiation at the end of the day is about not wanting it too badly. If you want something too badly, then the other person will be able to extract more price from it. If you do care more about something than the other person and they're taking advantage of you in a negotiation, then your best way to deal with that is to turn it from a short-term game into a long-term game. Try to make it into a repeat game. Try to bring reputation into line. Try to bring other people in who may have a say in the future or may want to play games with this person in the future. So an example of a very high cost, low information, single move game is you're having your house renovated. You're having your kitchen renovated. Contractors are notorious for overbooking, ripping people off, being unaccountable. I'm sure contractors have their own side of it. The homeowner has unreasonable demands. We found problems. The homeowner doesn't want to pay for it. They don't understand. They're low information buyers. It's a very expensive transaction. And historically, it's been very, very hard to find good contractors. And the contractor has no choice on what a good homeowner is. So you try to go through friends. You try to go through reputation. And what you're basically doing there is you're trying to convert a single move expensive game with a high probability of cheating on both sides into a multi-move game. So one way to do that would be say, well, actually, I need 2 different projects done. And so the first project we'll do together. And then based on that, I'll decide if we do the second project. And you can split your work up into 2 projects. Another way might be, I'm going to do this project with you. And then I have 3 friends who want projects done. And they're waiting to see the outcome of these projects. Another one might just be the same person operating within the same community and having a reputation in the community to protect. Another one could just be you write them a Yelp review or a Thumbtack review. So these are all ways of turning a single move game into a longer term game and helping get past a position of poor negotiating leverage and poor information.
Number 8, learn from first principles.
So I kind of try not to pay attention to what everybody else is doing so much, and I'd really try to understand everything from first principles. First principles means that you should be able to derive it without relying on definitions. If you keep having to define things by using fancy words, then that's a problem. The fancier the words you have to use to explain something, the less you actually understand it. So I try to understand everything in very, very simple terms, and I would rather understand the basics and not know the complicated stuff than vice versa, because then your knowledge is on very shaky ground. So that's one way to avoid the hype cycle. Another is to not have too many preferences. So if you have strong preferences as to how you think things should work out, either because you have a very strong sense of identity or because your politics lean very sharply left or right, then you're just much less likely to see things the way they're actually going to work out. The more dispassionate you are, the more likely you are to actually call the correct outcome, because we're masters at fooling ourselves and we want the result to work out a certain way.
Number 9, happiness and inner peace.
Modern life, on the other hand, is more hectic in other ways. The sources of stress that we have are more chronic. Let's define stress for a moment. Physically, stress is when something wants to be in 2 places at one time. If I take an iron beam and apply pressure to both ends in different directions, I'm creating stress in the beam because one part wants to be north, the other part wants to be south. I create stress on the beam. In a person, stress is when you can't decide what's important. It's an inability to decide what is more important. So then you want 2 things at once that are mutually incompatible. I want to relax right now, but I need to get some work done. I'm under stress. I need to go to that party, but I also need to go to work. But when you truly give up on something, it's actually no longer stressful. When you accept that something is completely out of your control, there's no point in being stressed about it. So it does imply that you have some level of control over it. The mind is constantly creating stress for you through situations where it's being more paranoid or more angry than is actually warranted for your environment. We want to find peace from mind. We want to have tools that allow us to not turn off the brain mind, because you can't suppress the mind. If I say to you, don't think of a white elephant, you just thought of a white elephant. So you can't force the mind into anything. But where the mind on its own calms down and naturally goes away. And how do you do that? How do you end up with a more peaceful mind? Because a more peaceful mind automatically creates a happier person. One phrase I liked is that peace is happiness at rest, happiness is peace in motion. A peaceful person doing an activity will end up happy doing that activity. A happy person just sitting there will be peaceful. So the goal actually is not happiness, even though we'll use that term a lot. The goal is actually peace. So the question is, how do you get to peace? The first problem with getting to peace is that no activity will get you to peace, because peace is fundamentally inactivity. Peace is the sense that everything is fine. And if everything is fine, you're not making physical activity to change it, so you're physically at peace. And you're not making mental activity to try and change it all the time either, or not wishing you were, because that'll create mental stress, because you'll want to mentally be somewhere other than you actually are. So peace itself is not a thing that can be directly achieved. You cannot work towards peace. What you can work towards is understanding. I think this is an old religious saying, but it says the name of God is truth. And what that's basically saying is that when you understand certain things, when you learn certain things, when you're convinced of certain things, and when they become a deep part of you, then you naturally become a more peaceful person.
Number 10, education and learning.
I think there's no question it's completely obsolete. The education system is a path-dependent outcome from the need for daycare, from the need for prisons for college-age males who would otherwise overrun society and cause a lot of havoc. The original medieval universities had guard towers that faced inwards, for example.
I did not know that.
Yeah, because you have to put a curfew in there, and you have to lock up the young 18-year-old males before they go out with swords and daggers and create trouble. So college and schools and the way we think about them, they come from a time period when books were rare, knowledge was rare. Babysitting was rare, crime was common, violence was prevalent. There was no such as self-guided learning. So I think schools are just byproducts of these kinds of institutions. And now we have the internet, which is the greatest web of knowledge ever created, completely interconnected. So it's very, very easy to learn. If you actually have the desire to learn, everything is on the internet. You can go on Khan Academy, you can get MIT and Yale lectures online, you can get all the coursework, you can get interactivity, you can read blogs by brilliant people, you can read all these great books. So the ability to learn, the means of learning, the tools of learning are abundant and infinite. It's a desire to learn that's incredibly scarce. So I just don't think that schools matter for self-motivated students. What the schools matter for is, one is they keep the kids out of the parents' hair while the parents go to work. It creates socialization because kids want to be around their peers and they want to learn how to operate in society of their peers. But I think if it's purely learning you're after, that learning can be done much more either on your own or through the internet, or by uniting through the internet with like-minded groups. So I think that's one problem with the current educational system. The second problem is, what do you choose to learn? And the current educational system has to have a one-size-fits-all model. It has to say, well, you have to learn X now, and then you have to learn Y. And to give you examples of where this is obsolete, memorization. Right? In a day and age of Google and smartphones, memorization is obsolete. Why should you be memorizing the Battle of Trafalgar? Why should you be memorizing what the capital of this or that state is? But we still put undue weight on that just because that's the way it's always been done. And we lived in a pre-Google world. Another example is how when we're moving along at a certain pace, I'm sure, not everyone, but I'm sure 90% of your listeners have had this happen to them, which is they were learning mathematics, and at some point they were keeping up. They were doing arithmetic, then they were doing geometry, then they did trigonometry, then they did pre-calc, then they did calc. And somewhere in there, they got lost.
somewhere in there, while building the massive edifice, the logical structure that mathematics is, they missed one lesson, they missed one concept, they missed 5 classes, or their brain couldn't think a certain way that something was being explained to them. It should have been explained visually, but it was being explained numerically, or it should have been explained symbolically, and it was being explained in cartography, what have you. But they were not able to keep up. And the moment you lose that rung in mathematics, the moment you miss that rung in the ladder, you can't go to the next one. Because now in the next one, the teacher's like, okay, we're done with pre-calculus, now we're moving on to calculus. And you're saying, wait, I didn't understand pre-calculus. And I understand how pre-calculus leads from trigonometry to calculus. I missed that whole part. So now you get to calculus, you don't understand the fundamentals, and now you reduce to memorization. So now you're like, oh, okay, dx, dy, when I see that symbol, I do this. Yeah. But now you've lost the actual learning. You've lost the connection to the underlying principles. Yep. So I think learning should be about learning the basics in all the fields and learning them really well over and over, because life is mostly about applying the basics and only doing the advanced stuff in the things that you truly love and where you understand the basics inside out. But that's not how our system is built. We teach all these kids calculus and they walk out not understanding calculus at all, when really they would have been better off served just doing arithmetic and basic computer programming the entire time. So I think there's a pace of learning issue. And then there's finally a what to learn. And there's a whole set of things we don't even bother trying to teach. We don't teach nutrition. We don't teach cooking. We don't teach how to be in happy, positive relationships. We don't teach how to keep your body healthy and fit. We just say sports. We don't teach happiness. We don't teach meditation. Maybe we shouldn't teach some of these things because different kids will have different aptitudes, but maybe we should. Maybe we should teach practical construction of technology and like maybe everyone in their science project, instead of building a little chemistry volcano, maybe you should be building a smartphone, right? So we just haven't kept up. And I have to believe that we can change the system, but you never change a system by taking the existing thing and reworking it. I don't believe. I've been in Silicon Valley and tech business long enough to know that you're better off changing it just by creating something brand new. So one fantasy idea I've had is, after I'm done with AngelList, or if I have more time on my hands, I would like to create a successor to the one laptop project. In MIT, Nicholas Negroponte had the one laptop per child project. Yep. But then I saw this fascinating write-up, and this is really a long time ago, maybe even 5 years ago, maybe it was in The Economist or somewhere. And it was a story about how they left a box full of unopened Android tablets in a little village in Pakistan. And when they came back months later, the kids have opened up the box. They've all figured out how to boot up the tablets. They've hacked them. They've gotten past the user administration root login. They've installed a whole bunch of apps. They've got a little economy set up. The older kids are teaching the younger kids. They're teaching their grandmothers how to run businesses. They're surfing the web. They've taught themselves English. Kids are learning machines. They just need the tools. So to that end, what I would love to do is create a very low cost, very rugged, easily powered, cheap Android tablet that's hard to destroy, and basically distribute them around the world with pre-built learning applications so that you can literally fire one up and it works with you interactively in 30 seconds and figures out what language do you speak, if any, or you can just be symbolic, and what level of aptitude are you at? Are you a second grader, third grader, fifth grader? And of course, it varies by different discipline. And then it lets you dive into and let you learn anything you want that will make your life better.
Just
and
on going the edge of your competency.
Exactly. And it always keeps you on the edge and it always keeps pushing you. And then you can network in all the teachers of the world. So anyone who wants to be a teacher can contribute. It's not just Salman Khan doing Khan Academy. But essentially, you could network connect all the teachers of the world and all the students of the world using tablets and do it at a pace and level where it's essentially customized for each child. And they're learning the things that have a practical outcome in their life. And I know there's advantage of liberal arts education, pushing things that people don't necessarily want to learn on their own, but they have to have some desire for it. It's better to wait until they think they're ready and then give it all to them. Because I think that's the way that learning sticks. So that's the kind of project I like to work on, but I don't think it's solvable with the current school system.
I hope you get a chance to work on that. I think that would be a phenomenal impact to the world.
Yeah, I think it would be fun, and I'm thinking about this now more because I have a young infant son, and honestly, I don't want to send him to school.
How do you as an adult, I mean, you mentioned a couple of physics books in the start of the interview here. How do you as an adult go about learning new subjects, you specifically? And
Yeah, mostly I just stay on the basics. So even when I'm learning physics or science, I'm sticking to the basics. So I'll read concepts for fun, but I'm more likely to, do something that is arithmetic than calculus. I'm not going to be a great physicist at this point. Maybe in the next lifetime, or when my kid will do it. But it's too late for me. So I have to stick to what I enjoy. And what I love about science is mathematics is the language of nature. Science is, to me, the study of truth. It is the only true discipline because it makes falsifiable predictions and actually changes the world. And applied science becomes technology, and technology is what separates us from the animals and allows us to have things like cell phones and houses and cars and heat and electricity. So science to me is the study of truth, and mathematics is the language of science and nature. So in that sense, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. And to me, that is the most devotional thing that I could do, to study the laws of the universe. And so the same kick that, some guy might get out of being in Mecca or Medina and, bowing to, the prophet, I get that same feeling of awe and that same small sense of self when I study science.